It was a cold winter night, and I was driving alone on a deserted road in the suburbs. After a long day at work, all I wanted was to get home. The surrounding darkness was oppressive, only interrupted by the headlights of my car cutting through the night. The radio was off, and the heavy silence was broken only by the sound of the engine and the wind whispering through the tall, shadowy trees. Every shadow seemed to move as I passed, increasing the sense of unease growing inside me. Suddenly, extremely bright headlights appeared on the horizon, blinding my vision. My heart raced. The headlights were approaching quickly, showing no signs of slowing down. It was then that I realized, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that the other car was driving on the wrong side of the road, coming straight at me. Panic took over. I yanked the steering wheel to the right with all my strength, trying to avoid a collision. The car skidded off the road and crashed into a ditch. The impact was violent, and for a moment everything went dark. When I regained consciousness, I realized I was uninjured, but my car was destroyed. The silence returned, but this time it felt more threatening. I looked around, trying to understand what had happened, and that's when I saw them. Two men were getting out of the car that had forced me off the road. They moved with a disturbing calmness, like predators knowing their prey had nowhere to escape. As I ran through the forest, my heart felt like it was about to explode. Every sound was amplified. Every leaf and branch became a treacherous obstacle. I glanced back quickly and saw the men getting closer. The moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy of trees, leaving the forest wrapped in an oppressive darkness. I stumbled over a root and nearly fell, but kept running, driven by pure survival instinct. The cold air burned my lungs, and my breath came out in white clouds in front of me. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed amplified. I heard the branches cracking under the men's feet, a constant reminder that they were there, hunting me. I reached a small clearing and stopped to catch my breath, trying to listen. The silence was deafening, but soon the sound of voices and approaching footsteps broke the stillness. I needed to think fast. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I saw a group of dense bushes on the side of the clearing and hid there, trying to control my breathing. The men entered the clearing shortly after. I could see them through the foliage, their silhouettes barely illuminated by the moonlight. One of them held something that glinted in the faint light, possibly a knife. The other looked around, searching for any sign of me. A chill ran down my spine. They started arguing, their voices muffled by the fear that consumed me. "He can't have gone far," one of them said, his voice rough and irritated. "We need to find him before he calls for help." I stayed still, praying they wouldn't see me. My entire body trembled, not just from the cold, but from absolute terror. I thought about my family, how I needed to survive to get back to them. The men continued searching for a few more minutes, their movements agitated and frustrated. Finally, one of them suggested they split up to cover more ground. They agreed and began moving away from each other, one of them coming in the direction of the bushes where I was hiding. I decided to move parallel to the path the men were taking, heading in the opposite direction to gain distance. The dense vegetation offered partial cover, but also made movement difficult. Every step had to be calculated to avoid dry branches that could snap and make noise. My body was exhausted, but fear kept me moving. I heard a frustrated shout echo through the forest. I knew they were getting impatient, and that could be dangerous. I hid behind a large fallen trunk, trying to decide my next move. I heard the sound of leaves being stepped on behind me and froze. The sound was getting closer. I held my breath, hoping the darkness would conceal me. Suddenly, a pair of strong hands grabbed my shoulders, pulling me back. Panic took over as I struggled to break free, but the man had an overwhelming strength. He threw me to the ground, and I felt the impact in every bone of my body. I tried to get up, but he was on me in an instant, his face twisted in an expression of anger and satisfaction. "Did you think you could escape?" he growled, his voice low and threatening. My heart beat uncontrollably, and my mind desperately searched for a way out. With one last effort of pure adrenaline, I managed to kick his knee, making him lose balance for a crucial second. I took advantage of the moment to get up and run again, but now I knew I was racing against time. I needed to find help, and fast. Running without looking back, I heard sirens in the distance, and saw flashing lights. My eyes filled with tears of relief, but when I finally reached the road, the sight froze me in horror. The lights I thought were from the police belonged to a row of cars with bright headlights, just like the first one that attacked me. Behind me, I heard disturbing laughter getting closer. I fell to my knees, realizing my escape had been in vain. As the car lights shone intensely, the feeling of despair increased. I looked around, seeking an escape route, but it seemed the forest and the road were closing in on me. The sound of laughter became louder, closer, and a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its face hidden in shadow, but its presence undeniably sinister. My body trembled, the realization that there was no way out sinking in deeply. At the last moment, before the figure could reach me, the car lights suddenly went out, plunging the forest into absolute darkness. Silence took over, and all that remained was the sound of my own ragged breathing. The terror of the unknown enveloped me completely, leaving me with a single, disturbing certainty. I would never be the same again, and the true nature of my pursuers would remain a dark and unfathomable mystery. The company had sent me on a last-minute trip through the desert, a long and solitary journey. With the sun already setting and my fuel tank almost empty, anxiety began to take hold of me. The desert landscape seemed endless, with no signs of life or help. The radio was off, and the heavy silence was broken only by the sound of the car's engine and the wind blowing over the sand dunes. As I drove, I watched the fuel gauge drop dangerously low. Finally, I spotted a police car parked by the side of the road. A wave of relief washed over me. Maybe there was someone there who could help me. I pulled over nearby and got out, hoping to find a police officer who could provide me with fuel or at least direct me to the nearest gas station. As I approached the police car, I noticed it was disabled and in poor condition, covered in dust and apparently abandoned. I approached cautiously, feeling a chill down my spine. I looked through the dusty window and saw no one. The silence around me was deafening, as if the desert itself was watching me. Then, something caught my attention. A figure appeared in the distance, running towards me. What seemed like a simple request for help quickly turned into a living nightmare. The figure was running towards me at an alarming speed. I couldn't discern many details because of the faint twilight, but its presence was clearly threatening. My survival instinct kicked in, and I started running back to my car. My heart pounded in my chest, and adrenaline coursed through my veins. I tried to open the car door with trembling hands, glancing over my shoulder to see if the figure was getting closer. I managed to get into the car and lock the doors, panting. The figure was now much closer, almost within reach. I started the engine, praying there was enough fuel to get me out of there. The engine roared and, for an agonizing moment, hesitated before catching. Finally, the car lurched forward, and I sped away, raising a cloud of dust in the process. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure stop abruptly, appearing frustrated. I kept driving aimlessly, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the place where it all happened. The desert around me seemed even more hostile now. Every shadow cast by the crescent moon seemed to hide new dangers. My thoughts were a mix of panic and confusion. Who was that figure? And why was it running towards me in the middle of the desert? These questions hammered in my mind, but there was no time for answers. I needed to find help before the fuel ran out completely. After what seemed like hours of aimless driving, I saw lights in the distance. It was a small service station with a single gas pump and a small building beside it. The feeling of relief was immediate, but I still didn't feel entirely safe. I parked the car and got out, still nervously looking around. There was a single police car parked there, and to my surprise, a police officer came out of the building when he saw me. I ran towards him, trying to quickly explain the situation. "My car is almost out of fuel, and I was chased by someone in the desert," I said, my voice trembling. The officer looked at me with a mix of skepticism and concern, but nodded. "Let's solve the fuel problem first," he said, guiding me to the pump. While he filled the tank, I explained more about the figure that had chased me. The officer frowned, looking more attentive. "That's strange," he said. This area doesn't usually have many people, let alone someone running through the desert at night. The feeling of unease grew again. Something was definitely not right. After filling the tank, the officer gave me some directions on the safest route to continue my journey. I thanked him and returned to the car, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Before leaving, I looked again at the vast, dark desert, feeling a chill down my spine. The officer waved as I drove away, and I continued my journey, still trying to process the bizarre events that had occurred. With the tank full, I continued my trip through the desert, but the persistent fear that the figure might reappear didn't leave me. The road seemed endless, and the darkness around me felt more oppressive than ever. What was that figure doing in the desert, and why had it chased me so determinedly? The questions kept hammering in my mind. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, the headlights illuminating only a few meters ahead. The desert, a vast expanse of darkness and mystery, seemed almost to swallow my car. The radio was off, and the silence was absolute, except for the sound of the engine and the wind. My mind wandered between fear and morbid curiosity about what had really happened that night. Suddenly, something by the side of the road caught my attention. It was a motionless figure, almost imperceptible in the darkness. My heart raced. Could it be the same figure that had chased me before? I slowed down, hesitant to check. Curiosity overcame fear, and I stopped the car, keeping the headlights on. I got out cautiously, adrenaline running again. The figure was there, motionless, almost like a statue. As I got closer, I realized it was just a pile of old clothes, probably left by some previous traveler. I felt a mix of relief and frustration. I got back into the car, trying to calm my nerves. The journey continued, but the constant fear that something was following me never completely disappeared. Continuing the trip, the feeling of being watched persisted, as if the figure was still nearby, hidden in the desert shadows. Fear mingled with exhaustion, creating a constant state of alert. The road ahead seemed endless, each kilometer stretching into an eternity. The high moon in the sky faintly illuminated the scene, casting unsettling shadows over the desolate landscape. Eventually, I saw a small town in the distance, its faint lights offering a promise of safety. With a sigh of relief, I drove towards it. Entering the town, the environment felt surreal, as if I were in a dream. The streets were deserted, and the few lights in the windows offered no comfort. I stopped at a motel, determined to rest a bit before continuing the journey. While checking in, the receptionist, an elderly man with tired eyes, looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You seem to have gone through something tough," he said. I tried to smile, but the memory of what had happened still haunted me. I went up to the room, locking the door behind me. Finally, I lay down on the bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The silence of the room was interrupted only by the distant sound of the wind. I woke up in the middle of the night, with the feeling that something was wrong. I got up and looked out the window. Outside, under the faint moonlight, I saw a figure standing in the parking lot, looking directly at my room. My heart raced again. The figure was motionless, almost like a shadow. I blinked several times, trying to confirm if it was real or a figment of my tired mind. When I finally gathered the courage to open the curtain and look again, the figure had disappeared. The mystery of the desert and the figure that chased me remained unsolved. The feeling that something or someone was always watching me never left. I knew that somehow my life would never be the same. It was a cold and rainy night when I received the last delivery of the shift. The package was for a place I had never heard of before, near a forest. The address seemed suspicious, but I decided it would be quick, deliver and head back home. The road leading to the destination was winding and poorly lit, increasing my unease. My GPS indicated that I was getting close, but the feeling of discomfort grew with each kilometer. Finally, I saw an isolated house on the edge of the forest. The place looked abandoned, with broken windows and a facade worn by time. I parked the car and got out, holding the pizza box. The sound of my footsteps in the mud seemed deafening in the night silence. As I approached the door, a man appeared out of nowhere. dressed in dark clothes that blended with the surrounding darkness. He had a sinister smile on his face, and his eyes gleamed in a way that made me uncomfortable. "You're late," he said in a slow voice. "Follow me. They are waiting at the edge of the forest." My mind screamed for me to turn back, but something in his gaze paralyzed me. Reluctantly, I started following him, the sense of imminent danger growing with each step. The mysterious man led me down a narrow path that went straight to the edge of the forest. The darkness among the trees was almost impenetrable, and the sound of the wind passing through the leaves seemed like a sinister whisper. As we walked, my heart raced, and I held the pizza box as if it were a shield against the fear that settled in me. Something was clearly wrong, and the idea of running began to take hold in my mind. We reached a small, silent clearing. The man suddenly stopped and looked around as if waiting for something. That's when I saw shadows moving among the trees. 2 accomplices emerged from the darkness, their faces partially hidden by hoods. They said nothing, just watched with cold, calculating eyes. Panic took over me. The pizza box trembled in my hands. "This is where you deliver," said the man, his smile widening in a disturbing way. I knew I had to act quickly. I threw the pizza box at him and ran back down the path we had come from. I could hear the quick footsteps of the accomplices behind me, but the adrenaline gave me a speed I had never experienced before. The sound of my feet hitting the ground echoed in my head, mixing with the noise of leaves and branches breaking underfoot. Running through the darkness, I felt the terror growing in my chest. The sounds of the men's footsteps behind me grew closer, like a constant threat. I tripped over a root and almost fell, but recovered quickly, driven by pure survival instinct. With each step, my mind desperately sought a way to escape. My lungs burned and my heart felt like it was going to explode, but I couldn't stop. Suddenly, I felt a hand grab my arm tightly. I turned and saw one of the accomplices, his eyes shining with excitement. Adrenaline took over, and I reacted instinctively, punching him in the face. He staggered back, and I took the opportunity to run again, but I didn't get far. The second accomplice caught up with me, pulling me to the ground. We fought fiercely, rolling on the cold, damp earth. With supreme effort, I managed to break free and grabbed a thick branch, hitting him with all my strength. He fell to the ground, groaning. Without wasting time, I started running again, now with the clear feeling that my life depended on it. The clearing was far away, but the adrenaline kept pushing me forward. Behind me, the groans and shouts of the accomplices faded, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. The fear of being captured again gave me strength to keep going. My mind was in chaos, but my body kept moving, guided by pure survival instinct. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, and I constantly looked over my shoulder, expecting to see the men following me. The trees passed like blurs, and my feet barely felt the ground as I ran. The edge of the forest finally appeared ahead, and the sight of the road brought a small relief. Upon reaching the road, I quickly looked around, searching for any sign of help. My eyes fixed on a distant light. It was the police station. I ran as fast as I could, feeling every muscle in my body protest, but I couldn't stop now. The lights grew brighter, and the sight of the solid, illuminated building brought a thread of hope. I arrived at the station panting, with my body aching and covered in dirt. I ran inside and shouted for help. The officers looked at me in surprise, but quickly took me to a room where I could explain what had happened. The words came out rushed and confused, but they seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. A team was immediately sent to investigate the delivery site. After what felt like an eternity, the officers returned. The head of the investigation called me for a conversation. "We found signs of a struggle and some clues, but nothing that clearly identifies who those men were or what they were doing there," he said with a worried look. "This is very unusual. We need you to stay safe while we continue the investigation." The experience left me deeply shaken. The memory of the sinister faces of the accomplices and the paralyzing fear were still fresh in my mind. I tried to carry on with my routine, but every shadow, every unexpected sound reminded me of that terrifying night. I began to question if I would be safe anywhere. A few days later, while trying to relax at home, an uncomfortable feeling invaded me. I looked out the window and saw something that made me freeze. In the distance, At the edge of my vision, there was a figure standing, watching my house. The fear returned with full force. I grabbed the phone to call the police, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. Was it my imagination? Or did they really know where I was? The police investigation didn't reveal much. The mysterious men and their intentions remained a mystery, and I was stuck in an endless cycle of fear and uncertainty. The feeling that someone or something was always watching me never disappeared. Every day, I lived with the uncertainty that the next delivery or the next shadow in the night could bring back the horror of that night at the edge of the forest.